Your Creative Push, episode 340.
Ideas flow from the hand to the brain just as much as they do from the brain to the hand.
Welcome to Your Creative Push, the podcast that pushes you to pursue your creative passions. I'm your host, Youngmin Brown, and my guest today is Donald Rattner. Donald is an award-winning residential architect and educator, and his new book, My Creative Space, draws on the latest psychology and productivity research to offer a practical guide to designing your home to optimize your creative potential. And Donald comes on the show today for one of my favorite conversations as of late. It is jam-packed with actionable steps and tips that you can take to maximize your creative potential in your home or in your kind of creative surroundings. Donald talks about why you should have a designated creative space and the importance of nature in our creativity and our mental and physical well-being. He shares some tips and tricks as to how to make your creative space make you feel more comfortable and therefore more creative and more open-minded and more adventurous. Donald shares how music and sound affects our creativity and the best decibel level for boosting your creative process. Donald and I also talk about the surprising benefits of napping to our creativity and why it works, and also the concept of idea seeding, something that I've actually been playing around with for the past year or two. And finally, Donald shares how working walls can help you externalize your ideas, the debate on messiness and creativity, and finally, some free, cheap, and simple tactics that people can use right now to optimize their creative space. Like I said, this is one of my favorite episodes as of late because I totally dug into his book and I tried my very best to cherry pick some of my favorite concepts from the book to call out for you in this episode. So without further ado, please welcome my guest today, Donald Rattner. Donald, welcome to Your Creative Push.
Thank you, young man. It is a pleasure to be here.
Now, it's a pleasure to have you on the show because I just finished your book. It comes at a perfect time for me. My wife and I just bought a house, and all the rooms are like done now after 6 months, except for my office. And it's been like a mental block for me because I just don't know what to do. And after reading your book, I have so many notes, and I feel like I can totally visualize it, and not just visualize it for like what it's going to look like, but like. So it will kind of serve a purpose for me to kind of help my creativity and help my podcast and help my writing and help everything else. So this book has been actually a game changer for me. So I can't wait to get into kind of the meat of the book and hopefully inspire some other people to not just change their kind of creative space for themselves, but also maybe learn some new tips that they never thought that they would kind of adventure into.
Well, thank you, young man. I appreciate those comments and congratulations on your new abode. That's very exciting.
Yeah,
and it's great in some sense that you left sort of say the best for last, but obviously an important space that has everything to do with the book. And I'd be super interested in seeing how you develop it. So you maybe take some shots before, which I assume is a more or less empty space, and then send me some pics of the after. I'd be fascinated to see how you utilize this information because I did make it in a way, or I did frame it in a way that people can actually apply, obviously, in real life, but also try to share a lot of the ideas and concepts about creativity in general. In fact, in some ways, this is much a textbook, call it, about what creativity is, as it is about how to use your environment to boost it for yourself.
Right, it absolutely is, because there's not just like tips for changing the space, but also kind of changing your mindset. I'm sure we'll get into some of them, but like things that you never think of, like the importance of napping, which is awesome, and just like smells and sounds and just kind of all of the senses and just making your environment work for you and for your creativity. So it's pretty awesome.
Exactly.
Let's actually just dive into number one, tactic number one, because you have 48 different tactics, I believe, as well as a bunch of other great information. Almost every single one of them I could actually apply if I hadn't already. But number one, I think, is maybe the most important for creative people that maybe underutilize this. Like they don't actually have kind of a designated creative space for themselves, a safe space, if you will. So could you talk about your tactic number one?
Sure. So each tactic has a little kind of label name. This is designate a creative space. That's point number one, tactic number one, technique number one, if you'd like. And what it's basically saying is that one should have somewhere in the world a space to which one comes regularly to do their creative work. Obviously, that has practical, ramifications, but I think even deeper is the idea that our minds become conditioned to associate that space with creative activity, with creative thinking, in the same way that, we all know the classic experiment of Pavlov's dogs, where this scientist, Pavlov, had dogs in his laboratory, and every time they were fed, he would ring a bell and kept doing it to the point where he could just ring the bell and the dogs would come running, salivating, even if there was no food actually in the bowl. So that's called classic conditioning. So a little bit, we're like Pavlov's dogs, that if we do something again and again and again, the association is etched in our neural pathways in our minds to the point where all we need to do is to enter that creative space to kick in a creative mindset. It's a wonderful story I tell in the book about Charles Dickens, obviously the great English writer who obviously was very fastidious about his creative space and would go to it regularly. But when he was on book tour, in fact, he came to America in the 1800s, what he would do is to rearrange the furniture in his hotel room to as closely resemble his study back home as he possibly could. And he would also bring along a few knickknacks from home to put on the desk so that he would associate his mind, his creative mindset with his creative space back home, even if he wasn't in it. Now, one thing that's important for folks, now you're fortunate enough to have a kind of dedicated creative space, I think, which is, in a lot of ways ideal. But, I lived in New York City apartments for many years, so I know what space starvation is like, where you have to double and triple up, on space and certain functions and so forth. So it's a lot harder to have this kind of, distinct space to enter into. But you can do things simple as, like, if you use the dining room table as your creative space, that's fine. Maybe you have some knickknacks of your own that you set up when you are about to engage in your creative session, or you use a placemat that you only use under your laptop when you're about to do some writing, or if you're doing some artwork, obviously you can bring out an easel or a particular piece of equipment or such. So as long as you can kind of condition a space and then take away those circumstances, you're almost fulfilling the idea of having this designated creative space as best you can.
Now, a lot of people that listen to this podcast are smart, very intelligent people, and myself included. Sometimes I know these are mental tricks, and I'm almost having to trick myself. Do you have any advice for people to get past that idea of, like, that you need to be this person with mementos that, puts out mementos so that you can get in the zone, or put on the music or put on the smells and, like, trick yourself into kind of getting in the zone where you don't necessarily feel like you're toying with your own intelligence. You know what I mean?
Well, I would almost say it's okay to toy with your own intelligence, that, the human mind is a complicated, complex thing. And it's, I guess, as one, I think, writer put it, we're rationally irrational or irrationally rational.
Yeah.
We are not purely rational beings. We react to things in ways that are completely counterintuitive. And we can talk about some of them, in part because our brains are still in, like, the cave people era to some degree, that we have a lot of legacy in the way we think that goes back tens and hundreds of thousands of years that we haven't been able to shake yet. And so we do things or react to our environment in ways that might not seem straightforward or logical or any of that. So I would almost say, let yourself kind of, accept some of the anomalies of human behavior and how the mind works. And as you kind of get into this material, you'll maybe hear about some of them. But here's the thing. All of the techniques, the tactics in the book are science-backed, right? I'm very fastidious and careful about not just kind of making stuff up that kind of sounds good or seems to work for some people, not others. Everything here has some kind of grounding in scientific research, which is not to say that that's infallible, but it certainly, I hope, gives it a certain grounding, a certain rigor that people will find engaging, even if they at first would think, oh, that's ridiculous.
For sure. One of the ones that we actually talk about on the podcast is the importance of nature, and not just taking a break and going for a walk per se, but just immersing yourself in the natural world. And that takes a very important part in your book as well. Could you talk about that?
Sure, absolutely. You're right. There's a whole cluster of tactics that center on the idea of the importance of nature, not just to our creativity, but to our whole mental and physical well-being. So this actually connects right back to what I was just saying a moment ago. So here's a few points to think about. We are, of course, Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens as a species first appeared on the African savanna roughly 190,000, 200,000 years ago. Genetically speaking, we are very similar to those original ancestors. Now, obviously, those first Homo sapiens were bioengineered, so to speak, to survive and thrive in a purely natural environment. There, of course, being no other kind. In fact, if you add up all the time since we first appeared on the savannah to the present, about 99% of that time has been spent in purely natural environments. And given the fact that evolution moves so super duper slowly, it has simply not had a time to catch up to the fact that today, in industrialized countries, certainly, we spend upwards of 90% of our time indoors, almost a kind of 180-degree reversal. Well, what happens is that we become a little bit like fish out of water. We literally start, metaphorically speaking, gasping for air, but more specifically, our mental and physical health starts to diminish somewhat. And this has been connected to if people who spend in a lot of time in environments where there is very little nature visible or evident have, all sorts of health problems. It could be any depression, anxiety, sleeplessness, even cancers have been tied to this deprivation. So not only are we physically diminished, but not surprisingly, we are creatively diminished as well, because creativity and health, and I'll throw in a third one here, happiness, all tend to operate on the same spectrum with regard to environment, which is to say things in our environment which promote the one tend to promote the other two, vice versa, and things that diminish one tend to diminish the other. So what can you do about this? Well, clearly, the best way to ameliorate this kind of deprivation is to try to bring nature in to the space in some way. Now, that can be as simple as you have a window, you look out, and like where I live, I'm very fortunate being surrounded by very abundant greenery, trees and rocks and animal life and terrain and so on and so forth. That literal input, that sensory stimulus coming into our brain through sight will create a kind of restorative effect in our minds and reboost or restore our creative abilities, our mental and physical well-being as well. You can also do simple things like put a plant on your desk or in your workspace. That alone, there's been a study where simply putting plants into a workplace has boosted idea generation among staffers 15 to 40%. So this is real results here. Natural materials, if you have a desktop that's made out of wood and you can see the grain, that's a natural stimulus. Smells, if you have aromatics or plants and such that create certain odors associated with nature, all of these things can kind of reconnect us to our natural environment. There's a whole field, if anybody's interested, called biophilic design. Some of your listeners, I'm sure, have heard the term biophilia, which literally means love of natural things. The idea being that we are, in a sense, biophilic creatures, that we have this natural affinity, so to speak, with the natural world, and that we need to maintain that connection. So there's a lot of techniques that wrap around that particular concept.
Definitely. And one of the other tactics that you mentioned, I believe it's number 4, of taking in a view and kind of positioning your space to be able to see the outside. That's one of the huge takeaways that I had for myself of where I'm going to position my desk, and not just position it so I can look out the window, but so that I can get a view of my office itself and not just staring at a wall. And this idea of the prospect refuge that you mentioned in your book, could you talk about the importance of that?
Sure. So there's actually a couple of aspects, and very often with these tactics, there are multiple ideas running through them as to why they work the way they do. So with taking in a view, there is, and we could talk about some of the others, the idea of creating a sense of distance, of a spatial expansiveness, if you like, which boils down to one of my theses in the book, which is the more open our sense of our surrounding space, the more open-minded we become, open-mindedness being a key facet of the creative personality, open to new ideas, open to new ways of doing things, open to rethinking, and so on and so forth. So that's one aspect of it. The other you're talking about more specifically is the tactic I call face your space. And this actually ties into feng shui. There's a few overlaps with the book, between the book contents and feng shui, which is obviously a more traditionalist, pre-scientific approach to kind of environmental design. But the basic idea is that here again, we're going back to our kind of cave people, bioengineering, genetic dispositions, DNA, whatever you want to call it. The idea is that we were motivated in our very first days to seek out habitats, home, places to live, that would provide maximum prospect, by which generally in this case we mean view. So think like a 180-degree sweep, right? If you swivel your head from left to right and back again, you can pretty much max out at about 180 degrees, which means you can see everything in front of you. But at the same time, this habitat, wherever you choose to locate your shelter, should also provide refuge, meaning protection from possible attack, whether it's from wild animals or hostile tribes coming at you from your blind spots, which are mostly at your flanks, behind you, and above you. So it's obviously a technique that Mother Nature, so to speak, has programmed us with in order to maximize the chances that we would remain alive, right? And our population would flourish or continue to grow. So applied to space design, and here's where we see this kind of legacy, this vestige of our original genetic wiring, still in effect, even though we're no longer worried about somebody sneaking up on us in our own home or being attacked by a wild animal. We are still more comfortable, more relaxed, more satisfied, more positive in our affect, as the researchers say, when we're positioned in a space, if we're talking about a room, such that you can see the room in front of you and you have protection behind you, which usually means a wall, right? So if you have a desk or a work surface or an easel or any kind of setup of that sort, what you want to do is position it so that you're obviously a few feet away from the wall, so you can get behind that space, that you have the wall behind you, and then you're looking into the room. In an ideal world, you would also be able to look out a window, perpendicularly, let's say, or straight ahead, and you would also have a view of the entry into the room. So you're not surprised by anybody, quote unquote, sneaking up on you from behind, all of which, again, very much ties into feng shui. Perhaps coincidentally, perhaps feng shui just kind of understood all of this intuitively. So bottom line is, when we're feeling more comfortable, more relaxed, more safe, positive mood, we tend to be more creative because we're willing to take risks, to go places where people generally don't go, to expose ourselves to potential ridicule or criticism. That is, comes part and parcel with being creative. Whereas when we tend to be stressed or feeling vulnerable, such as if we're facing the wall and our back is to the door, our back is to the space, then we shift into kind of the flip side, the left brain thinking, the analytic cognitive style, as it's called, which is all about focus and reason and logic, which is part of the creative process, but it's at a different stage than the initial kind of idea generation phase.
Right. And it's so interesting you mentioning that, because for me, I know my mood, my mindset, however I'm feeling, gets into my writing. It gets into the way I sound on a podcast, like how, interested I am in the subject matter, or how excited I am to like maybe inspire somebody else. My mood is 100% correlated to my creative output. And so many of these tactics are meant to put you in that safe space where you're unafraid to be vulnerable or to be adventurous, like you said. It's just putting yourself in that best possible position. And also for the whole prospect refuge thing, I listen to music when I write and when I do stuff. So I have headphones on, and the idea of the entryway being behind me always like kind of freaks me out a little bit, or puts me a little bit on edge. So that's a very interesting thing too. And actually, speaking of music, that is another one of your tactics, of the sound, and not just the types of sounds that you're listening to, or the type of music maybe that you're listening to, but also the level of volume, which I found fascinating. So could you talk about sound and how that affects our creativity?
Sure. All right. So music, there's actually two aspects we can kind of subdivide. There is listening to music, as you're talking about. And here there are some general kind of rules of thumb as to which kind of music works best. For example, there is obviously the fact that you want to like the music you're listening to. Generally speaking, you want to listen to something that's familiar, reasonably familiar, and that in ideal terms doesn't have lyrics. But if you are listening to something that has lyrics, but they're like super familiar, you've heard it 1,000 times, that's also good. Clearly, mood, as you're talking about, is an important role. You want to, align the musical choices to the kind of mood you're in, which doesn't necessarily mean it has to be happy stuff. If you're writing a sad part of your novel or what have you, you might actually want to calibrate the music to kind of fit the mood of the writing. But with all of these things, what you ultimately want to make sure is that your mind isn't drawn too much to the music, where your attention turns and focuses on the music. And that's why familiarity and instrumental music and things of that sort, all of which is to create just enough kind of, call it distraction, not distraction in a bad way, distraction in a good way, to take kind of the edge off your self-awareness, self-consciousness, that analytical side of your kind of mindset, so that you have that little bit of kind of creative dreaminess to some degree, as you say, sort of relaxed inventiveness. All of that is good. The other aspect of music that has been shown time and again to be beneficial to creativity is actually making the music yourself, meaning playing the piano, playing an instrument, playing something, particularly as it comes to breaking through log jams, impasses. And classic examples in real life would be Albert Einstein, who used to pick up a violin when he hit a brick wall in his, computations. He would play it and for a while and not really think about his problem. And of course, a light bulb would go off and he would put down the violin and run back to his notebook. And this is really described in some detail, I think, by his wife, in fact, who talked about it. And then even in fiction, of course, Sherlock Holmes also uses the violin to kind of figure out some of his detective puzzles. What they have found through research is that let me just back up 1 second. If you ask most people what's the ideal sound level when you're doing your creative work, I think a lot of people will intuitively say, oh, quiet, isn't that like the best? Or wouldn't that be just most productive for me? Well, maybe, but maybe not. So according to the research, what they found is that a kind of sweet spot in sound levels is 70 decibels. So 70 decibels, just to give you a point of comparison, is roughly what you'll probably hear if you walk into your local coffee shop on a, reasonably busy afternoon and there's lots of people sitting around chit-chattering and you kind of hear that murmur, that conversation going on behind you. That's probably around 70 decibels. Crickets, maybe, if you got a lot of crickets in your neighborhood, as I do at night during summer months, crashing waves. And the key thing is, you'll notice with all of those references to noise is that they are white noise, right? They are unintelligible sounds. They are not specifically understandable, discernible information. So people listening to phone calls next to them at the office or wherever, that's the worst possible kind of distraction, where, again, here you have just enough kind of rubbing against your self-consciousness to keep you in that creative mode.
Right, and it's interesting, the kind of correlation to sleep. Like for me, I need some white noise. I need like a fan running, or obviously the best one is rain outside
Right.
to put me in that kind of comfortable mindset. So it makes a lot of sense that the same type of noise that would help me to drift off into sleep and kind of let go of life, so to speak, would also help the same exact way with creativity in terms of letting go.
Right. And there are, for the folks who are actually noise starved, if you don't live in a city
Yeah.
or wherever, there are actually apps. In fact, there's one I think called Rain.fm, maybe, or maybe that's an internet radio station.
Yeah, that's it.
Coffitivity has tracks where you can literally make it sound like you're in the middle of a coffee shop, even if you're at home and there's nobody around. So there are ways people use to kind of create the sound, even if it doesn't exist naturally.
Right, right. And we'll link up some of those apps or resources in the show notes page today as well. And actually, kind of speaking of sleep, I mentioned this at the top of the episode, but the idea of napping. So this is something that for me, when I take a nap, like I'm out. Like napping, I guess I don't do it right because I probably sleep too long, but I usually end up waking up groggy and not necessarily feeling fulfilled or
Right.
feeling like that it was a good idea to take that nap. But you suggest for some people to actually take a nap, and you mention a lot of really great historical figures that have used napping to help them in their lives. So could you talk about napping?
Well, sure. So, you say you're out when you're napping, but you're actually not as out as you think you are, right?
Mm.
I talk in the book about, I actually quote a passage from a book called, I think it was Brain Rules by a neuroscientist named John Medina, where he has a wonderful passage where he calls it, which he titles, "You Call This Sleep?" And he goes through this whole long description about how your brain is actually cranking away while you are asleep. But here's the thing. Obviously, it's not your conscious brain that's cranking away. It's your unconscious brain, the back of mind, so to speak, which is where a lot of creative thinking actually happens. Of course, we have to be, at times awake and deliberate in our creativity, obviously, to get some work done. But a lot of idea formation is actually happening below the threshold of conscious or very close to it. In any case, when you are napping, your back of mind is in a lot of ways doing picking up a heavy load for you. So if you'd been working on a problem up to that point, a creative problem, a creative work, your brain is picking up where you left off, only it's doing so in the very powerful kind of back of mind regions where things are churning around and memories and associations can happen and come together and connect in ways that you're sometimes not able to do when you're awake. So there is that aspect. There's also a fairly, significant body of research which suggests that we are actually, again, bioengineered, physically designed to take naps, and it's only with the advent of the light bulb and the Industrial Revolution that we kind of got into this notion of a straight 8 hours of sleep at night, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of, various other activities. There seems to be evidence that no early mankind, humankind, would take naps by nature, so to speak. There's even references in like Chaucer and other books to what they call the second sleep. So you got the one during the afternoon, the nap, the short one, and then the longer one at night. So we may be rubbing against our natural selves by kind of going through the day and banging through things. And yes, lots of famous people would take naps. Certainly Edison was a classic nap taker. He even had a little sort of self-generated technique where he would sit in his, easy chair or whatever, kind of get ready for a nap, and he would pick up a series of, I guess they were ball bearings or, small round spheres of metal and hold them in his hands so that, eventually he would sort of nod off. The grip around these ball bearings or whatever they were would loosen. The ball bearings would fall to the floor where they would clatter, make a big noise, wake him up, and he would then grab a notebook and pencil pen and write down whatever was kind of churning around in his mind. Because one of the techniques I talk about is called exploit the groggies, which is to say that being in this sort of netherworld or interstitial space between consciousness and unconscious is very fertile for your creativity, because a lot of the inhibitions or the kind of controlling executive functionings that we use to direct our behavior when we're fully conscious are, somewhat deactivated. And so again, these things from back of mind can kind of come forward and, bubble to the surface, manifest themselves. Now, the key thing there is you got to capture them. That's what the notebook was for Edison. That's what the notebook should be by your bedside. If you wake up in the middle of the night, it's there. When you get up first thing in the morning, and a lot of creatives do this, just do a mind dump into that journal or or if you must use a phone or tablet or something of that sort, that's fine too. But you want to capture those ideas, because you might think, oh, I'll remember this one when I get back to my desk or workspace or whatever. But 9 times out of 10, you're going to forget it, because we can only keep a certain amount of information in our brains at any one time, because more information needs to come in and take its place as we get through our day. So lots of benefits for napping for sure.
Absolutely. And you hit on two big things that I talk about all the time is keeping a notebook with you at all times to get those ideas down, because they do go away, or maybe even go to somebody else.
Right.
And also, yeah, like using your subconscious to work out problems, like before going to sleep at night, thinking through those big problems that you have, but not stressing yourself out necessarily, but just asking yourself those questions, like what is it that's missing from my novel, or what is it that's missing from this song or piece of art or whatever it may be, and letting your subconscious kind of go at it while you're sleeping.
Right. And people, there's a great technique I came across called idea seeding, seeding, where doing what you're kind of talking about. One of the last thing you want to, maybe creative folks want to do before they go to sleep, is just think about the last paragraph they wrote, or the last stroke of the brush, or some problem, as you say, that they were thinking about, and just kind of leave it there. When you go to sleep, there's a very good chance your unconscious mind will pick up on what you left it with, so that when you wake up, you may have some ideas bubbling around.
Right. And one other important note from your book is that you shouldn't necessarily nap in bed. Like you should have like maybe another designated space for napping.
Right. Yeah, I think just as a kind of good practice, you want to associate your bed with long-term sleep, night sleep, presumably, and find another place to do a map. Because again, it gets into that kind of classical conditioning thing. Whereas, and maybe, young men, you are, I don't know if you're napping in your bed or not, but when you say you're maybe going a little too long and you're feeling groggy, that's definitely because you're probably extending the ideal nap period a
Guilty.
little far. Yes. Yes, ideally. So that can just be a chair, it doesn't have to be a whole, another space. But if you can find a day bed as a piece of furniture or a little nook, those are great places to separate. But here's the thing with bedrooms, very important, not just for creativity, but just for your kind of mental well-being, is really limited to just sleeping and sexual intimacy. Don't put TVs in there. Don't put phones in there. Try to get rid of, things that beep and blurt and make noises and colored lights. It really wants to be designed for sleep. And I give a whole bunch of techniques for how to make rooms more restful, bedrooms more restful, that can really help you do that.
Another big takeaway that I had from the book was making your walls work for you, and not just displaying art because that's inspirational, or even like vintage travel posters you mentioned, and just kind of surrounding yourself with inspiration from maybe other people or even your past work, but making your walls work for you in terms of turning a wall into a working wall, which I didn't think I had the courage to do, but maybe I do. I think I might make it like a dry erase wall. Now, can you talk about that, but also maybe give me some kind of encouragement? Because one of the things that scares me about that is having all of my unfinished kind of fresh ideas that might be stupid, which, of course, I always encourage, write down all the ideas, stupid or not, like worry about whether they're stupid or not later. But now my possibly stupid ideas are on display. So that's one of the fears that I have for having a full wall of like basically my brain dump.
So yes, I mean, walls are for more than just separating spaces, for creating privacy from one place to another. They can be active agents in the creative process. They are, in fact, very powerful tools for creative folks. And for all the reasons you mentioned, certainly on a level of display, and that is very important, that we kind of surround ourselves with creative things, whether they are by our own hands or by people who we admire, because that really does have a very positive effect on our mood, on our mindset. But even beyond that, one of the techniques that I just, can't recommend enough, is turning your wall into a drawing tablet, in essence, through the use of whiteboard paint, chalkboard paint, dry erase paint. They're kind of all referring to the same thing, though with obviously slightly different aesthetic properties. Doing that just does so many things for creative folks. For one thing, it allows you to externalize your ideas, meaning getting them out of your head and into the world in some kind of concrete form, where they can then constitute an idea library, right? Again, you may very well forget them if you don't get them out there. So you've captured the idea. You can then develop the idea further. And what I particularly like about working walls is that, I would say the sky's the limit, but you could literally paint from baseboard to ceiling, from one end to the other, an entire surface. And we could be talking 8 feet by 10 feet or whatever that dimension is. That's a huge surface. So in a way, if you want to think big, draw big, go beyond even just the limits of a notebook, because you can just kind of stretch your imagination in ways that is tough to do with a more limited surface. And obviously it is erasable. So, things can change, ideas can come in, ideas can come out. Another great benefit I talk about is that it does allow for collaboration with others, right? It's hard to invite people into your creative idea space when it's a small spiral notebook. I mean, of course you can show it to others, but it's more limiting when you have something that's, out there, big wall. You could have 1 or 2 or 3 people over and kind of talking about your ideas. And that's, very important for creative folks, that, we can't all think of everything ourselves. Bringing others into the mix, seeing a detached viewpoint that we might not otherwise be able to do ourselves, is hugely, hugely beneficial. And there's even kind of the accidental creativity that can come out from this, which is kind of what you're touched on a little bit there, which is you leave your ideas out there and maybe somebody else comes along in that space or down that corridor and sees what you had been working on. You may not even be there, but they're thinking, oh, I've been thinking kind of the same thing. I should talk to Youngmin or so-and-so, and maybe we can put our heads together and do something. So there's all sorts of benefits. As far as worrying about something kind of silly getting out there into the world, well, that just kind of comes hand in hand with being creatives. That's that risk-taking element. It's part of the territory. And I don't think you should feel embarrassed or otherwise. And even if the idea itself is maybe a little off base or something, you'd be surprised on how when other people look at it, they see something where they can connect another dot, draw a line from here to there and say, oh, okay, that your kind of funky idea did lead me to this thought. Maybe we should, look at developing that. So I would never hold back. I would always put it out there. And by the way, folks, I know you have a lot of visual artists that listen to your podcast. So these are people who clearly could probably draw very well. But for those who feel maybe I'm not an artist, quote unquote, more the writing type, the word types, these don't have to be beautiful drawings. This is doodling, right? This is visual thinking. It's not about making art unto itself, although that's wonderful too. It's about expressing your ideas in ways, not just words, but through diagramming and image making as well. Important part of how we think as people.
Yeah. The thing I love about the concept of having a working wall is just that it's so big. And at least for where I envision putting mine, it's right there in front of me. So I'm always kind of pushing the idea of being amongst your materials, being amongst having your easel out, having all your materials out and ready to go. And the idea of having my ideas there puts me in my place where it's like, all right, there it is. I can't just store this away in a notebook and close the notebook, or I can't just store this away in my brain. It's like, here's the idea. It's already started. Let's keep going. The idea of having it there kind of pushing me to kind of continue.
A motivating tool, yeah.
For sure.
And listen, when Einstein died, he had 10,000 pages of notes, and Leonardo, famous notebooks. These are obviously very smart, creative people, but they needed to kind of work with their material outside themselves. They couldn't do it all in their heads. And you have this wonderful interaction with your own ideas when you project them out there, when your hand is moving, which, by the way, is also part of this kind of whole discussion, which is when you get your hand in motion, you are pumping up your kind of idea factory several times over. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that ideas flow from the hand to the brain just as much as they do from the brain to the hand. So that's also part of the equation of using that working wall to your benefit.
Right. And kind of going along with that, like I just said, the idea of being amongst your materials or just being surrounded by your art or your paints or your ideas even. So through this book, you have all these beautiful pictures, these like really neat creative spaces. And, here I'm going to try to make a neat creative space, and then I'm going to mess it up by like being amongst it and doing the work. So do you have any advice for like kind of like a balance between those things of having the aesthetically pleasing, inspiring space around you, but then being amongst it and really messing things up by doing the work?
Yeah, it's funny. You ask about that. So here's the thing. So being an architect that I am sort of naturally drawn to, images of very beautiful spaces. There's no two ways about it. And the funny thing is when I, would go to my fellow architects or designers and request images from them, as I do in the book, there's a few, pieces of my own, but there's lots of images. In fact, there's like over 200 photographs in the book, and many of them are of professionally designed interiors, not all by any means. But what you notice, of course, is that, when these are professionally photographed spaces, everything looks beautiful. Everything looks totally together, composed to the nines.
Yeah.
Whereas, in real life, of course, we're all working and we got stuff going around and things are on the floor and pieces of paper strewed around the desk or whatever, of course, in real life. And I did try to find some images of spaces where people are actually making a mess. And we could talk about messes later on if you'd like. But, I think it's as you say, it's a balance. It's a kind of space that definitely has appeal to you. And again, since you have so many, I'm sure, visually oriented creatives in your audience, this I think will happen naturally. The eye just wants to be drawn to things that appeals to it. But at the same time, that doesn't mean take away from the fact that you got to make a mess, and absolutely go ahead and do so. In fact, there's some evidence that making a mess is good for creativity. So, at the end of the day, some people like to clean up at the end of the day before they shut off the lights to their creative space, so it's kind of restored to its more pristine nature. That's fine. Or if you like to come in and leave the mess there, that's fine too. It's going to have a beauty for you, I think, either way, or an appeal for you either way. It depends on your own individual characteristics. But don't feel you have to keep. In fact, I would recommend against keeping creative spaces absolutely pristine in a way that sort of controls your mindset or puts you into a more analytic mindset than you might want.
Right. And let's talk about that further, actually, because your tactic number 44 is make a mess or not. And
I'm hedging my bets there.
That's a good idea. Very smart man. Yeah. So you even mentioned Marie Kondo in that in that chapter, and my wife she went on like everybody else. Went on the Marie Kondo kick.
Right.
And then, when I don't fold my clothes the Marie Kondo way, I'm in trouble.
You hear about it. Yeah.
I hear about it. But I don't necessarily like my undershirt, like, I don't love it. Like, it's great, but like, I don't feel like I need to love my undershirt. Like when I fold it, it's just doing its job. So could you talk maybe about, maybe even from you personally, your kind of take on the making a mess or not?
Yes. So a couple of things here. I would say, just kind of broadly speaking, with all of these techniques, with all of these tactics, because they're science-based, they are derived from studies of general populations, right? If you have 50 subjects or 75 subjects in your research experiment, what you want as a scientist, ideally, is that all those people are pretty much one and the same kind of person, right? This is theoretically speaking, because you don't want individual differences to skew your results. So you're going to start with a fairly homogeneous population, and what you want to come out with is what would the quote-unquote average person how would they react to such and such an environmental cue or to such and such a design trigger or input, sensory input? When it comes down to you or me or the folks listening, obviously all bets are off because we are individuals. And of course, we have different habits and tastes and preferences. So, for example, while the research might suggest our peak creative times is in the morning till early afternoon, you, young men, may be a night owl. Don't know if you are, but you might be a night owl, and you're doing just fine being a night owl, even though the research says by and large people are best oriented to such and such a schedule. Absolutely fine. You got to kind of pick and choose which work for you and which don't. But what I would say is try to keep an open mind going into this material, because sometimes you might say, you know what, I hadn't thought about that. And, I was feeling a little uncomfortable, like you were talking about in terms of your orientation with the back to the space. Let me try flipping around the space, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the first thing I would say. Now, with mess, and it's funny because when I give talks about the book, this is often a question I get. People want to know, what's the deal with mess? Should I be messy? Should I not be messy? And that's why I kind of, as I say, hedge my bets with make a mess or not. This one in particular, there's evidence for both approaches. So for the not mess people or the not mess argument, the Marie Kondo folks, your wife, there is a lot of evidence that almost by kind of negative default or negative information, which is to say that when the mess becomes untenable and gets kind of out of control, we can suffer all sorts of physical and mental health diminishments, harm, everything, again, from anxiety and irritation and bad moods and so on and so forth, loss of control over oneself. Lots of bad things can happen when we're in an over-cluttered environment or we feel like our possessions have got the better of us. And obviously that's going to be bad for creativity. By the way, there's plenty of, creatives who are definitely historical, eminent creatives who are perfectly neat and so forth. Yves Saint Laurent, the fashion designer, Eleanor Roosevelt, lots of folks. And I must say myself, I tend to be a pretty neat person. I kind of got a almost hyperactive sense of organization. Maybe that comes from being an architect, where in a sense we're always putting things in their place, so to speak. So I like my environment actually fairly tidy, and I kind of react negatively even to just modest messes. But there is certainly one experiment, I think from 2012, 2013, which studied two groups of people undergoing or pursuing some kind of creative problem-solving task. So they had one group around a table that was kind of, just mess and stuff is all over the place and there's just no rhyme or reason to it, part of their creative problem-solving exercise. And they worked through their, problem and came up with their answers. And then there was another group that worked around a very neat and tidy table. And what they found is, by and large, the solutions to the creative problems amongst the messy people were better, just more creative, more original, more thoughtful than those around the neat desk. So start getting into speculation. Well, why would that be the case? Well, one possibility is that there's a kind of social norm attached to neatness. If you invite people over to your house, 99 times out of 100, you will tidy up the house before they come over because it's kind of expected that, you wouldn't present them with a mess. There is that aspect. So being kind of messy rubs against social conventions, rubs against social norms, creativity often being the same. My personal take is that, creativity is by its nature a messy process in the sense that it's not linear. It's not neat and tidy. You don't march from point A to point B to C to D to E, done, finished. You're all over the place. You're zigzagging. Your thinking is bouncing from one thing to another. It's a much more loose and almost randomized type of activity. So a messy environment lends itself to that. So there's kind of a nice middle ground. One of the images from the book is of Mark Twain sitting in his townhouse, I think in New York City, roughly 1900. And in front of him is a big desk, and it's just covered with papers and stuff. And, it's that classic messy space, or idea space, I should say, because around him, the rest of the parlor, the background is all very neat and trim. So in a sense, his mental space, his creative space, his idea space, as represented by the top of the desk, that's a mess. That doesn't mean your whole house has to be, a total chaos and so on and so forth. So that's kind of an interesting middle ground. But here again, it's coming down to, kind of what works for you. So it sounds like your workspace is going to kind of be a little bit more, shall we say, messy, randomized, loose, whereas your wife maybe says the rest of the house got to look like this, and the two of you hopefully will happily live ever after.
Hopefully Marie Kondo doesn't drive a wedge that we can't get past.
Well, that's where you start to say, this is my space in here, and
right.
I need it to be kind of this way. And, and I see how our living space wants to be in a different way, and you kind of both meet each other in the middle.
Absolutely. Let's talk about for people who, because I'm sure anybody that gets your book is going to want to think things through like I did, and, take the time to maybe completely redo their creative space at least. But what about for people listening right now? What's like one or two things that anybody could do right now that, on any budget, maybe just a few different mindset shifts for somebody to practically make some changes right now?
Oh, there's a whole bunch of things that, certainly don't involve cost necessarily, or construction or things of that nature. I mean, even just what we've talked about so far, like maybe your desk is facing against a wall. Maybe you want to just turn it around. That doesn't cost you anything to move furniture, change your perspective, and so on and so forth. There's lots of tactics that don't, again, involve construction or expense. For example, I talk about ideal lighting levels for creative problem solving. And here again, it's one of these sort of more counterintuitive pieces of information, which is that dimness is actually very conducive to kind of a brainstorming stage, let's say early stage creativity. Why would that be? Because the less information you have coming into your brain, the more, again, that kind of back of mind thinking, the more unconscious thinking or subliminal cognitive styles can kind of come to the fore, right? Because if you lower the lights in your space, you can't see detail, you can't see every nook and cranny, and also your sense of the enclosing space, of the boundaries, the walls become more murky, especially at night if you can really make it dim. So there's a simple, technique, and this, as I say, is very good with when you either hit an impasse, kind of dim the lights, sit in the space, just let yourself kind of mind go. And you can also use it. I like to use it in the shower, right? So if you go in the shower, which is a classic idea, incubator, which again costs you no money, instead of having the lights in the bath full blast, actually dim them somewhat. And it's just one more factor. And the shower has lots of things going for it, but it's one more way to stimulate that kind of idea generation that goes on in the back of mind.
Right. Just the idea of allowing yourself to daydream and to zone out and finding the spaces to do that, whether it is in the shower, which is a huge one for me, or, just before bed, or a walk in nature, or having a lounger that you can sit in, and just allowing yourself that time to just either meditate. You mentioned meditation and yoga, and even just daydreaming, just allowing yourself that time to think and to work a problem out.
One of the, I break all these techniques down into 3 groups, and one of the groups I call the action tactics because they're things people do that have been found to promote creativity. And you just ran through a whole bunch of them. Even your posture can make a difference. Lying down and reclining, for example, is a great way to get the ideas flowing for reasons having to do with how our brains function and hormones and things of that sort. So a lot of these action tactics are, just that, just doing things, not necessarily changing your space. But once you know what these action tactics are, you can then create spaces that encourage you or facilitate your doing them.
Absolutely. We'll leave it at that because there are, I actually have a bunch of notes with a whole bunch of more tactics. Almost, like I said, almost every single one of the tactics and your explainers added a new element or a new thought to me for kind of redesigning my workspace and my creativity nook, as I like to call it. So we will let people get the book for that. Again, it's My Creative Space, How to Design Your Home to Stimulate Ideas and Spark Innovation. I can't recommend this enough. I will be going back to this a lot, I believe, in the next few years, because it's not just for redesigning my space, but just redesigning my mindset. So I really appreciate the book and appreciate you coming on, man.
It has been absolutely my pleasure, and thank you for all those kind words about the book. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And and the number one thing too, we haven't painted the room. I was going to paint it red. I was like, you know what? Let's go red, which tactic number 2, I should not do that. At least if I want to, stimulate my creative ideas or feel safe. So
I would not advise it.
Dodge that bullet.
Dodge that bullet. Yep. Good job.
And again, for people who want to check out Donald and the book, head to donaldrattner.com. That's with 2 T's, Rattner. And we'll have that linked up at today's show notes page, yourcreativepush.com/Donald Rattner. Donald, thanks again, man.
Thank you, young man. Enjoyed the conversation a lot.
Me too, man. Huge thank you to Donald once again for coming on the show. I hope that this episode inspired you, and I hope that during the episode you were thinking about your own creative space or potentially another place that you can go to get your creative work done where you feel the most safe and comfortable. That was one of the big takeaways that I had from this episode, and I think you heard it throughout the episode, the idea of being safe and comfortable, so that you are in that place, physically, but also mentally, to be vulnerable and to take risks and hopefully limit or completely eliminate all of the other worries and things that are going on in your head while you're trying to get to that creative process. So it's not just eliminating all those other things and having this kind of sacred place that you can go to where you feel safe and comfortable, but it's being in the best mindset while you're there. It makes total sense when you really think about it that we do our best work when our brain is free to kind of play, when you can go to recess and not worry about the enemy at your back, when you can feel completely open. So even if you don't get the book, hopefully there were some actionable tips for you in this episode, some simple kind of tweaks that you can make to your physical area where you do take refuge and get to your creative process so that you can more effectively get to it. And as for me, I am getting my creative space up to snuff for my patrons. They have already seen my office and a sneak peek of my new sort of podcasting booth, my little soundproof area that I'm trying to get together for your listening pleasure. And you'll be able to see that progress as well on the new YouTube channel, which is actually starting to launch this week. And as for the podcast itself, announcement time, we are coming back full-time February 17th. That's a Monday, and then we will have new episodes for you every Monday after that until whenever the next break occurs. Hopefully not for a very long time. But yes, back to full-time as promised to hopefully get you to get to your creative work. But hopefully today you were inspired to get to your creative work, to feel a little bit safer, and to maybe make some changes so that you can get to your best work and be in the best mindset and the best creative space and headspace possible for yourself. And once again, if you want to find out more about Donald or find some more tips, head to yourcreativepush.com/340. That's today's show notes page to find more information and everything we talked about with Donald. And that's all I've got for you today. So hopefully you were inspired to get your work done. So go and get it done. And we will see you next time if you need that push again. I love you all so much. Go get it done. Bye. Never miss a push. Head to yourcreativepush.com/subscribe to find the easiest way for you to subscribe to the podcast.